Exact moment a grieving dog, clear across the yard, jumped to his feet, as if he'd heard a silent cry, for no one at the rescue center understood why a blind, fading baby elephant suddenly stirred at the help. Days later, the boldest decision in the center's history was made, placing that dog in the same room with the dying calf. But no one could have predicted what happened when the two finally touched, an impossible moment that would change the fate of everyone who witnessed it. The desert morning over northern New Mexico came in slowly, washing the low hills and scrub with soft, pale light. At the far edge of the Sierra Wildlife Rehabilitation Center, the barns and enclosures sat quiet, outlined against a sky that hadn't decided yet whether it would be kind or cruel. Inside, the air still held the chill of night and the faint, clean smell of hay and disinfectant. In the last row of the elephant barn, past the stalls where healthy calves would one day learn to play again, there was a narrow corridor that staff rarely lingered in. At the very end of it stood a single steel gate, heavier than the others, backed by thick wooden panels and extra padding. The keepers had a nickname for it, a name they never used in front of visitors. They called it the last stall. Behind that gate, curled into himself as tightly as his small body would allow, lay a blind baby elephant. His name was Mika. At barely 4 weeks old, he should have looked round, awkward, and clumsy with baby fat. Instead, his skin hung in loose folds over his ribs, like a too-big coat on a child who had suddenly stopped growing. Both of Mika's eyes were gone beneath swollen, raw lids bandaged with medicated gauze. A scatter of pale scars ran from his forehead down toward his cheeks, the cruel signature of the homemade explosive that had taken his sight and his mother in a single deafening second. He breathed in short, uneven pulls, as if every inhale had to climb a hill he wasn't sure he wanted to climb. Dr. Aaron Whitfield stood just outside the stall, one hand resting on the cold steel of the gate. At 48, he had seen more than his share of broken bodies, wolves caught in traps, eagles with shattered wings, bears burned in wildfires. But there was something about Mika that cut deeper than he wanted to admit. Maybe it was the size of him, small enough that 2 strong men could have lifted him. Maybe it was the way he made no sound at all. Beside Aaron, Emily Ross shifted her weight from one boot to the other, fingers twisting the end of her ponytail. 29, new enough to the center that she still apologized to every animal she vaccinated. She had been on duty when the truck rolled in the night before. She had watched the rangers unload a bundle of gray silence from the back. 4 stiff legs, dangling trunk, bandaged face. She had whispered his name the first time, like it might scare him if she said it too loud. Now she knelt just inside the gate, careful and slow, and let her hand hover a few inches above Mika's shoulder without touching. "Hey, little guy," she murmured, voice barely more than breath. "It's Emily, same one from last night. You're safe here, okay?" Mika did not move. His ears lay flat against his skull, his trunk tucked under his chest, as if he were trying to fold himself into nothing. There was a quiet humming from the IV pump in the corner, a soft drip of fluid into a vein in Mika's front leg. It was the only thing keeping his organs from giving up. The milk formula they offered every 3 hours sat untouched in the stainless steel pail by the wall, a thin skin forming on top. Each time Emily had tried to guide the nipple to his mouth, Mika had turned away, teeth clenched, as if refusing food was the last bit of control he still owned. Aaron's gaze traveled over the stall. Heat lamps, thick straw, soft padding on every hard surface. From the outside, it looked like safety. From the inside, it felt like a waiting room between 2 worlds. "He's not just hurt," Aaron said quietly. "He's gone somewhere else. He doesn't want to come back." Emily swallowed, her throat tight. She had thought the same thing in less clinical words. A gust of wind slid under the barn door and rattled the hanging halters on the wall. Mika flinched so sharply his whole body jerked. His legs scrabbled against the straw, trying to rise, but his muscles trembled and gave out. For a moment, the stall filled with the harsh, desperate breathing of an animal, convinced the world was exploding around him again. Emily froze where she was, afraid that any movement would make it worse. Aaron stepped back from the gate, jaw clenched. Somewhere deep in his memory, a different barn flashed across his mind. Another baby elephant, another set of bandages, another set of numbers on a chart that had looked this bad. He had lost that calf 3 days after arrival. For years afterward, he had told himself there was nothing he could have done. Looking at Mika, he found himself doubting that for the first time. At the far end of the barn, a younger keeper pushed open the side door, letting in a rectangle of thin morning light. The brief shaft illuminated dust motes and the edge of Aaron's profile before the door fell shut again. In the momentary quiet that followed, Mika's breathing slowed, his body sagging back into the straw, like someone who had fought hard only to realize there was nothing worth winning. Beyond the elephant barn, separated by a gravel path and a row of wind-twisted pines, sat a smaller block building with chain-link runs attached. That was the domestic animal wing, the place where surrendered dogs, lost cats, and the occasional rescued farm animal waited for their own second chances. From one of the outdoor kennels, a single dog lifted his head at the sound of Mika's brief struggle. He was a large black dog with a faint white streak along his chest, his coat dull from many days of not caring how he looked. His name, printed neatly on the metal tag above his run, was Shadow. He lay with his chin on his paws, eyes fixed on the barn doors as if he could see straight through them. When Mika's panic had spiked, Shadow's ears had pricked, his gaze sharpening for a few long seconds before the quiet settled again. A volunteer passing by his kennel reached down to scratch absently between Shadow's ears, but the dog barely reacted. His tail did not wag. His eyes didn't flick toward the treat pouch on the woman's belt the way they had in his first week there. Instead, he kept staring at the barn, brow furrowed in a way that made him look almost human, listening for something only he seemed to notice. Back in the last stall, Emily finally slid her hand the last few inches onto Mika's shoulder, her palm resting against skin that felt too warm and too thin. "We're not letting you go without a fight," she whispered, unsure if she was talking to him or to herself. Aaron heard the words and didn't correct her, though he knew the numbers, knew how often, not without a fight, still ended in white sheets and quiet rooms. For a few heartbeats, nothing changed. Then Mika's ear twitched, just once, a tiny motion, like a loose page caught by a breeze. His trunk uncurled the smallest bit, tip lifting an inch away from his chest before settling again. It wasn't much. It wasn't nearly enough. But in the dim light of the last stall, with the IV pump humming and the desert morning slowly brightening outside, it was the only sign either of them had that somewhere inside all that fear and pain, Mika had heard her. And far across the yard, in his run beneath the pines, Shadow closed his eyes, as if filing that fragile sound away for something he did not yet understand. The conference room at Sierra sat at the back of the main building, a square space with no windows and a fan that ticked softly when it turned. Staff jokingly called it the war room on better days. On days like this, when the blinds were drawn and the coffee went untouched. They called it something else under their breath. The place where hope was measured and sometimes quietly turned off. A monitor on the wall glowed bluish in the dim light, showing Mika's chart in thin, unforgiving lines. Heart rate, hydration, weight, all of them sliding in the wrong direction. A still photo in the corner, taken on admission, showed a tiny gray body on a stretcher, bandages bright against his face. Someone had tried to crop out the blood. It hadn't helped much. Dr. Aaron Whitfield stood at the far end of the table, hands braced on the edge, sleeves rolled past his elbows. He had been up most of the night, moving between the barn and his office, adjusting fluids, checking vitals, pretending not to notice that every number he adjusted slid back down as soon as he turned his back. Now he watched the room fill with people he knew and trusted. People he had disagreed with 100 times and loved anyway. Linda Harper took a seat near the monitor, a folder balanced on her knee. At 55, the director carried herself like someone used to signing things that hurt. She had the look of a woman who believed in doing the hard, right thing, but who still kept every name and face of the animals she'd lost. Next to her sat Dr. Samuel Pierce, the animal behaviorist, his glasses pushed up on his forehead, fingers laced tight. Emily slipped in last, hair still damp from a rushed shower, scrub top half tucked into her jeans. She sat near the door, but leaned forward as if she could climb right into the center of the table if she had to. In her hand was a small tablet loaded with camera footage from the barn. She held it like evidence she wasn't yet sure anyone wanted to see. Aaron cleared his throat, more to break the silence than because he was ready. "You all know why we're here," he began. "Mika's condition is declining, rapidly." He tapped the tablet in front of him, and the numbers on the monitor shifted, displaying the last 5 days as a steady slide. "He's not taking formula. IV fluids are buying time, but they aren't feeding him. His blood work this morning shows severe dehydration and early organ stress." Linda nodded once, eyes on the chart, but not surprised. "And pain?" she asked. Her voice was even, practiced. "Have we got control?" Aaron hesitated. "Physically? Yes. He's medicated. But that's not what's killing him." He moved to the next slide, a short clip of Mika turning his head away from the bottle again and again, trunk clenched. He doesn't want to engage, with food, with us, with anything. Samuel leaned back, studying Mika's curled body on the screen. "This is learned shutdown," he said quietly. "He's not just scared. He's made a decision, as far as his nervous system is concerned. Everything he knew about safety died out there, and he's choosing not to come back to a world that feels wrong." He glanced at Aaron. "We've seen this before. We don't always win." The fan on the ceiling ticked its slow, patient rhythm. Linda closed the folder on her lap. "We have a responsibility," she said. "Not just to try, but to know when trying becomes cruelty. If an animal is suffering with no reasonable path to recovery, we have to consider euthanasia. You all know that. None of us like it, but..." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. The word hung there anyway. Emily shifted, the chair creaking under her. "With respect," she said, voice a little too tight. "We've had him less than a week. He's never known this place as anything but pain and strangers and needles. We don't know yet what he might respond to. Yesterday, when a halter fell off a hook, he panicked so hard he could barely breathe. That's not him failing treatment. That's him reliving something we weren't there." 4. She reached forward, sliding her own tablet into the center. "I want you to see this." The clip was brief and grainy, shot from a corner camera in the barn at 2 a.m. The audio was low, but the sound of the wind rattling the doors was clear. A distant bang, just a loud gust slamming a loose panel, sent Mika into a full-body flinch, legs scrambling, trunk pressed so hard into the straw, it seemed he was trying to dig his way out of the world. Even after the noise faded, his sides heaved like he was choking on the memory of something much worse. In the tiny square of another camera feed, out by the kennels, a dark shape lifted its head at the same moment. Shadow, half asleep before the wind burst, snapped upright, ears pricked toward the barn. His run was quiet, empty except for him, but his gaze stayed locked on the direction of Mika's stall until the baby's movement slowed. Only then did he rest his chin back on his paws, eyes open and watchful. Samuel paused the clip there, rewinding that small motion, that shared jolt between two animals who had never met. "That's interesting," he murmured. "The dog and the calf spiking at the same trigger. Two different species, same response." He looked up. They're carrying similar maps in their heads. Different landscapes, same storm. Linda exhaled slowly, torn between curiosity and the weight of the decision pressing in. Aaron felt the old memory rise again. Another calf. Another chart. Another room like this. Back then, he had listened to someone else talk about responsibility and suffering and the limits of medicine. He had signed his name with a hand that shook and told himself, afterward, that there was no other road to take. Walking out of the barn after they sedated that calf, he had promised, quietly and bitterly, that if he ever saw a crack of light in a case that dark again, he would not be the first one to turn away. "I'm not saying we ignore the reality," he said now, voice rougher than he intended. "Mika is dying, I know that. You know that. But I'm asking for time. 10 days. Let me try things that aren't in the book. Adjust his environment, change how we approach him, explore options with behavior support. We owe him more than 5 days and a chart." He glanced at Linda, then at Samuel, then at Emily's anxious face. "If nothing changes, I'll be the one to put the papers on this table. I'll sign them myself." Silence settled like dust. The fan ticked. Out in the distance, a dog barked once and fell quiet. Linda looked around the room, weighing not just data, but the people in front of her. The young keeper with tears she was trying to swallow. The behaviorist leaning towards the screen. The vet who carried ghosts from a different barn and a different baby. 10 days, she said at last, each word measured. Under strict review. Daily reports, no false hope to the public. We owe him our best, not our sentimentality. Relief washed through Emily so quickly it made her dizzy. Samuel nodded, already making notes, ideas forming about sound, routine, trauma. Aaron let go of the table edge and straightened, the tight knot in his chest loosening just enough to let a breath in. They had not saved Mika. Not yet. But they had not written his ending either. Somewhere beyond the walls of that windowless room, the blind calf lay curled in straw, and the black dog in the kennel yard lay with his ears tuned toward a barn he could not see. For now, both of them were still here. For now, that had to be enough. The afternoon sun was sliding low over the pines when Aaron left the main building and crossed the gravel path toward the smaller wing of the center. The kennels sat quiet this time of day, the dogs stretched out in patches of sunlight or dozing in the shade of their runs. The air smelled of warm dust, metal fencing, and the faint sweetness of cedar shavings. An oddly comforting mix compared to the sterile weight of the elephant barn. A volunteer named Maria was finishing her shift, locking up the supply shed. She nodded to Aaron with a gentle, knowing smile. "You're back," she said softly, as if she could read the heaviness in his shoulders. "Something on your mind?" But she didn't wait for an answer. People at Sierra learned early that when Aaron wore that look, words were only going to get in the way. He walked the length of the kennels slowly, pausing at each run. Most of the dogs lifted their heads, tails thumping hope against the concrete. But one didn't move. At the far end, in the quietest enclosure, a run partially shaded by a crooked old pine, lay Shadow. The big black dog rested with his chin on his paws, his ears loosely forward, his gaze fixed on some point only he seemed to see. Aaron stopped at Shadow's gate, hand curling around the cool chain link. "Hey there," he murmured. Shadow blinked once in acknowledgement, but didn't get up, didn't wag, didn't offer the smallest sign of excitement. Yet his eyes, not dull, but tired in the way grief makes a soul tired, followed Aaron's every breath. It was as if the dog was measuring him, weighing the space between them with an awareness too sharp to ignore. Jake, the young intern, hurried over from the far end with a bundle of leashes in his arms. "I figured you might stop by," he said, leaning an elbow on the fence. "Shadow hasn't moved much today. Didn't touch his breakfast. Just stayed there." His voice softened. "Sometimes he twitches in his sleep, like he's hearing something, or remembering something, but then he goes still again." Aaron crouched, studying the dog through the fence. Up close, Shadow looked both strong and worn, broad shoulders under a dull coat, paws big enough to hint at his working dog roots. A faint scar ran across his muzzle, half hidden by fur, but unmistakably earned. Shadows of soot or ash still clung to the deeper parts of his coat, no matter how many baths the volunteers had given him. "Tell me again," Aaron said, "how he ended up here." Jake hesitated before answering, as if the story carried weight even in the telling. His family lived near the ridgeline where the wildfire jumped last month. They didn't have time to get everyone out. His owner, Daniel Reed, went back inside the house to get his sister's kid. Roof collapsed before he could get back out. Jake swallowed, jaw tight. Shadow was outside, barking himself hoarse. When they pulled him away, he clawed so hard at the driveway his paws bled. A long breath left Aaron's chest. He looked at the dog again, seeing now not just a shelter case, but something else. A creature folded in on himself, the same way Mika was folded, both trapped in memories too loud to escape. He reached through the fence, letting his fingers hover an inch from Shadow's cheek, offering space, but not forcing anything. Shadow didn't lean in, but he didn't pull away either. His eyes softened, dark and ancient with quiet understanding. For a moment, the air between them felt charged. Not dramatic, just thick with recognition, as if both of them could feel something shifting that they couldn't name. A breeze swept through the kennels, rustling the pine needles overhead. The faint metallic clank of a gate echoed from somewhere down the row. Shadow stiffened, ears pricking sharply toward the elephant barn in the distance. Aaron followed the dog's gaze automatically. Through the open corridor between buildings, he could just see the high roofline of the barn and the narrow windows that let in the morning sun. He couldn't hear anything from here, but Shadow could. Dogs almost always did. And whatever flicker of sound he caught, it pulled something alive and alert through every muscle of his body. Jake frowned. "He does that a lot. Whenever Mika panics, well, whenever anything loud happens in that barn, Shadow reacts. We thought it was coincidence at first. But it's not. He's tuned in. Like he's listening for someone he lost." He shifted, folding his arms. "Kinda reminds me of that calf in a way." The words hung there, fragile but heavy. Aaron straightened slowly, feeling that same thought take root. Two animals who had never met, flinching at the same echoes, carrying the same invisible wound stitched into their instincts. Different species, different tragedies, but the same map of fear burned into them. Shadow rose then, slowly, stiffly, and stepped closer to the fence, his nose pressed to the metal, breath warm in small puffs, as if asking a question he couldn't voice. His tail didn't wag, but his posture wasn't empty anymore. It was almost hopeful, just barely. A hint, the first thaw of snow long before spring. Aaron felt something shift inside him too, something that had been locked away since the day he lost the other calf years ago. He didn't let himself name it hope. Not yet. But it was close. Close enough to hurt. Close enough to matter. "You heard him, didn't you?" he whispered. Shadow held his gaze, unblinking, and in that moment the answer felt clearer than speech. Maria walked past again, humming to herself, unaware of the small storm gathering in the space between a grieving dog and a grieving calf. She smiled at Shadow, slipped a biscuit through the bars. He didn't eat it, just nudged it aside gently with his nose, his eyes flicking once more toward the barn. Aaron stepped back from the kennel, the gravel crunching under his boots. He didn't have proof. He didn't have a protocol. All he had was the faint stir of an idea forming out of grief and instinct, as wild and fragile as anything he'd ever dared to imagine in this line of work. Shadow watched him leave, ears forward, as if sensing that the world, his world, Mika's world, was about to shift in a way neither of them could predict. By the time Aaron reached the end of the walkway, the sun had dipped behind the ridge, leaving a soft lavender glow over the center. The barn lights blinked on one by one. Somewhere inside, Mika lay curled tight in the straw, hearing too much of what had been lost. And in the kennel yard, Shadow lowered himself back onto his blanket. But his eyes stayed open, tracking the barn with a focus that felt almost like a promise. The next morning broke clear and cold, with a hard blue sky stretching over the New Mexico hills. From the outside, Sierra looked calm, just another day of feedings, cleanings, quiet routines. Inside, though, a very different kind of work was about to begin. Aaron walked the hallway towards the conference room with a notepad in his hand and a knot in his stomach that refused to loosen. He had spent half the night bouncing between the elephant barn, the kennels, and his office. Each time Mika flinched at some distant sound, Shadow would stir in his run as if the same echo had brushed past him. By 2 a.m, Aaron had stopped telling himself it was coincidence. By 4, he had stopped pretending he didn't know what his instincts were asking him to do. When he stepped into the conference room, the fan on the ceiling was already spinning lazily. Linda sat at the head of the table, a mug of coffee cooling in front of her, papers spread in a neat arc. Samuel leaned back in his chair, eyes on the blank monitor as if he could see ahead to whatever was coming. Emily hovered near the doorway, twisting her fingers together. And Jake took a seat against the wall, unsure if he belonged, but unwilling to be anywhere else. "All right," Linda said, once the door clicked shut. "You asked for 10 days, Aaron. You said you had ideas you wanted to try. I'm listening." There was no challenge in her voice yet, just a careful neutrality, the sound of someone bracing for impact. Samuel nodded once, inviting him to go on. Even the fan seemed to slow, as if the room itself were leaning in. Aaron laid his notepad on the table, but didn't look at it. "You've all seen the footage," he began. Mika's reactions to sound, Shadow's reactions at the same time. 2 animals in different buildings responding like they're hearing the same gunshot over and over. He drew a breath. "They're on the same wavelength, whether we like it or not." Jake shifted. "Shadow's not just reacting," he said quietly. "Last night, when the wind slammed the barn door, he was up before half the alarms. He didn't bark. He just listened, like he was waiting to see if someone needed him." His voice trailed off when Linda glanced his way, but the words were out there now, hanging between the charts and the coffee cups. "I've been thinking," Aaron continued, "that we keep trying to reach Mika with our tools. Medicine, routines, recorded calls. None of it is getting through the wall he's put up. But Shadow's living in a very similar wall. Same cracks, same dark corners. I can't help but wonder if he might be able to slip through where we can't." The room went utterly still. It was Linda who reacted first. Her brows shot up, and the professional calm in her face hardened. "You're suggesting we put a traumatized working dog in the same room as a blind, panicked baby elephant," she said slowly. "A prey animal, cornered, half-starved, with a predator species." She set her mug down so carefully it didn't make a sound. "Do you hear how that sounds?" Samuel didn't jump in right away. He rubbed his thumb along the edge of the table, thinking. "Under normal circumstances, I'd call it irresponsible at best," he admitted. But these aren't normal circumstances. Both animals are dying by inches. We are not talking about disrupting a stable herd or a well-adjusted dog. We're talking about two souls circling the same drain. He glanced at Aaron. How would you do it? Aaron had expected the resistance. He had counted on it. Still, his throat felt dry as he outlined the plan. A neutral observation room near the clinic, stripped of anything sharp or dangerous. Shadow on a breakaway harness that staff could release from outside if needed. Multiple exits, multiple handlers, cameras rolling. No surprises, he said. No pushing. Shadow goes in first. Mika is brought in only if his vitals are stable. The moment either animal spikes beyond safe levels, we separate them. Emily found her voice somewhere in the middle of his explanation. He calmed down when Shadow reacted, she said, almost to herself. In that clip after the bang, Mika's panic dropped faster once Shadow settled, like he could feel there was another heartbeat out there that understood. She lifted her eyes. We've thrown everything else at this, and he's still slipping away. I don't want his last days to be just us watching monitors and apologizing. Linda looked from one face to another, weighing not just the ethics, but the sheer human ache in the room. If this goes badly, she said, we don't just lose one animal. We could lose two. And we send a message to the world that we let desperation override judgment. Her gaze softened for a heartbeat. But if we don't try and we watch that calf fade out knowing there was a chance, however thin, we didn't take. The question hung there longer than any answer. Finally, Samuel exhaled. We document everything, he said. We treat this as a formal trial, not a stunt. If it fails, we learn. If it works, he shook his head, a faint, incredulous smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. If it works, it changes more than this one case. Linda closed her eyes for a moment, then opened them with the kind of resolve that had carried her through floods and fires, and more loss than she cared to tally. One session, she said, in the observation room. With every precaution we can think of. I want crash carts outside the door, sedation ready for both. And if at any point this looks like it's tipping into chaos, we stop. No argument. She looked straight at Aaron. This is on you. He nodded, accepting the weight without flinching. I know. In truth, he had known that from the first spark of the idea, when he stood at Shadow's kennel and felt that strange, quiet understanding pass between them. It wasn't a gamble he was taking lightly. It was a promise. To the calf he had failed years ago, to Mika, to Shadow, and maybe to himself. When the meeting broke up, chairs scraped softly and the fan kept ticking overhead, indifferent to the decision that had just been made beneath it. Emily lingered by the door, watching Aaron gather his notes with hands that were steadier now than they had been in days. Jake slipped out ahead of them, heading toward the kennels with a new kind of urgency in his stride. Outside, the air had warmed, carrying the smell of sun-baked earth and pine resin. From the barn, faint and muffled, came the slow, strained rhythm of a baby elephant trying to rest in a world that no longer made sense. In the kennel yard, as if the sound had been carried on some thread only he could feel, Shadow lifted his head and looked toward the main building. Tomorrow, his world and Mika's would finally collide. For now, the center held its breath and waited. The morning of the trial session rose pale and cold, the kind of dawn that felt like the world was holding its breath. Frost still clung to the shaded corners of the compound, and a thin ribbon of mist drifted along the gravel paths. Inside the observation room, the overhead lights glowed low and warm, casting soft shadows along the padded walls. Every object had been removed except a thick mat, a few folded blankets, and a pair of portable monitors, humming in quiet anticipation. Shadow arrived first. Jake guided him through the side entrance with a loose grip on the leash. as if afraid to interrupt whatever instinct had carried the dog this far. Shadow stepped inside without hesitation. He paused only once, just long enough to take in the smell of the room, before padding to the center and lowering himself to the floor. His posture wasn't relaxed, not exactly, but steady, deliberate, as if he knew this wasn't a place for fear. From behind the glass, Aaron watched the dog's movements carefully. Shadow's ears were forward, but not stiff, his breathing slow, even. Every sign said the same thing. He understood that something fragile was about to be asked of him. Samuel murmured a quiet note into his recorder, documenting the dog's calm orientation. Emily stood beside him, fingers pressed against the glass, unable to look away. On the other side of the building, the elephant barn stirred as Emily and 2 handlers prepared Mika for transport. The calf was lying on his side when they entered, his trunk tucked under his jaw, breath shallow but steady. Emily knelt close, letting him scent her before she touched his neck. "Easy, sweetheart," she whispered. "We're just taking you to a warmer room. Nothing scary." She said the words with practiced calm, even as her hands trembled. Mika didn't rise on his own. He was too weak. The handlers eased a canvas sling under his small frame, securing the straps with slow, careful movements. When they lifted him, his front legs kicked weakly before falling limp again. The tremor that ran through his body wasn't strength. It was fear, or memory, or both. Emily walked beside him, one hand resting near his shoulder to give him something familiar to lean toward. The hallway between the barn and clinic was quiet enough to hear every creak of the sling rig. As they neared the observation room, a faint shift rippled through Shadow's posture. His head lifted, his ears angled toward the doorway. His tail made one small, deliberate thump against the mat. It was not excitement. It was readiness, the sense of a door opening somewhere invisible. When the handlers brought Mika through the door, the room changed. The air itself seemed to tighten, like the first second before a storm hits. Shadow stayed completely still, his body low, his gaze soft and steady. He didn't make a sound. Mika, lowered onto the mat opposite him, curled into his usual defensive posture. Trunk tucked, ears flat, body trembling in tiny spasms he couldn't control. His breathing spiked on the monitor, sharp and uneven. Samuel spoke quietly through the intercom, reminding the team to stay hands-off unless intervention became necessary. Emily bit her lip, watching Mika's panic rise. "Come on, baby," she whispered behind the glass. "He's not here to hurt you." But Mika didn't know that. As far as the world had taught him, everything that came close carried danger. Shadow made the first move, not with his body, but with a sound. A low, almost musical whine drifted from his throat, soft enough to barely register on the monitors. It wasn't pleading. It wasn't warning. It was a tone that lived somewhere between reassurance and sympathy. A sound meant for creatures who knew loss. Mika's ears twitched just slightly. A break in the wall. Shadow let out another gentle whine, then shifted. Slow, measured, as if every inch mattered. He didn't move toward Mika. Instead, he rotated his body so they were parallel, facing the same direction. Samuel straightened behind the glass. "That's companion body language," he murmured. "Dogs do that when they don't want to intimidate." He's speaking to him. Mika's breathing, though still fast, began to steady. His trunk uncurled a single inch, the tip trembling as if unsure whether to reach or retreat. Across the room, Shadow lowered his head and exhaled softly through his nose, an invitation without pressure. Emily's eyes filled when she saw it. "He's asking permission," she whispered. "Like he knows what that calf has been through." Minutes passed in slow, careful silence. Shadows stretched as the overhead lights brightened. Mika shifted again. This time a small, tentative movement, that brought him half an inch closer to the dog's direction. His trunk hovered, wavering in the space between them. The monitors beeped in a slower rhythm now, no longer jagged, but cautious and curious. Then it happened. A quiet, almost imperceptible moment, but one that cracked open everything the room had held. Mika extended his trunk the final few inches, until the soft, trembling tip brushed against the fur of Shadow's paw. The contact was feather-light, as if made by a creature afraid the world would shatter at the slightest pressure. Shadow held perfectly still. Then, with infinite gentleness, he shifted his paw just enough to let Mika know it was welcome. Behind the glass, Emily covered her mouth. Jake let out a soft, stunned laugh. Even Linda, arms crossed, trying to protect her heart from hoping too soon, blinked hard against the sight. "My God," she whispered. He reached for him. The room softened after that. The tension drained slowly, like a tide pulling back from the shore. Mika eased onto his side, still touching Shadow's paw. His breathing was calm now, steady enough that the monitor settled into a smooth cadence. Shadow, sensing the shift, laid his head down too. Close but not crowding, as if he'd always known this was where he belonged. And for the first time since the explosion that stole his mother, Mika slept without trembling. Shadow didn't sleep. He stayed awake, watching him with quiet, patient eyes, as though he understood that keeping watch was the first gift he could give. The days that followed settled into a rhythm so gentle it felt almost borrowed from another life. Each morning, before the sun had fully cleared the ridge, Shadow was led to the observation room first. He entered with the same quiet certainty, nose lifting to recognize the familiar scent of blankets and straw. His paws made soft thuds on the mat, a steady, grounding sound that seemed to steady the room itself. Mika arrived minutes later, carried or guided depending on how strong he felt that day. His legs were still shaky, his weight still too light. But something in his posture had changed. He no longer curled into himself the moment he entered. Instead, he tilted his head fractionally, trunk lifting just enough to search for the presence he knew would be there. The fear hadn't vanished, but it no longer owned every part of him. Shadow always greeted him the same way. A soft exhale, a low, warm rumble deep in his chest. It wasn't a growl, it was something closer to a hum, a sound that had no place in any training manual, but somehow made perfect sense to both of them. Mika's ears fluttered at the vibration, and the tension in his body eased, like a tight thread loosening one careful knot at a time. By the end of the second week, their ritual had grown more layered. Shadow would circle the room slowly, letting Mika track him through sound alone. The elephant calf followed the movement with small shifts of his trunk, turning toward the faint whisper of paws brushing the mat. When the dog paused, Mika paused. When the dog settled, Mika settled too. Samuel noted it all with quiet amazement. Two wounded creatures building a language without words. One morning, a breakthrough arrived without warning. Shadow was sitting beside a shallow bowl of warm elephant formula. His body angled just enough to signal safety. Mika's trunk brushed his shoulder, then followed the faint scent of milk. Instead of pulling away like he had done for days, he leaned in, found the edge of the bowl, and drank. Not much. Not enough for celebration. But enough for hope to feel real, not imagined. Emily cried behind the glass. She didn't try to hide it. Even Linda, who guarded her emotions like state secrets, let out a slow breath that trembled at the end. "This is not just behavioral," Samuel said softly. "This is trust. Trust we couldn't give him ourselves." His voice held the kind of wonder usually reserved for miracles too small to announce themselves. As Mika grew stronger, Shadow shifted his role without being asked. He became more active, introducing small games into their sessions. He nudged a softball toward Mika's trunk or trotted lightly across the room, letting the calf follow by sound. Mika responded slowly at first, tapping the mat as if mapping the world inch by inch. But curiosity replaced fear, and soon he followed the faint squeak of the ball or the rhythm of Shadow's trot with a confidence that none of the staff had expected so soon. One afternoon, during a windstorm that sent dust spiraling across the compound, the power flickered. A metal door slammed somewhere down the hall, a sharp echo that would have once sent Mika into a trembling collapse. Instead, he startled hard, legs splaying slightly, and his breath hitched in his chest. Shadow reacted instantly. He pressed his body against Mika's shoulder, leaning his weight with a protective firmness. Mika froze, then breathed out in a long, shaky exhale. The panic dissolved before it could bloom. "That's emotional regulation," Samuel whispered, leaning close to the glass. "The dog is grounding him. Animals don't do that unless they've chosen someone." Emily smiled through her tears. "He chose him on day one," she said. "We just weren't brave enough to believe it yet." In quieter moments, the two simply rested together. Mika's trunk would drape lightly across Shadow's side, the way a calf might seek comfort from a sibling. Shadow accepted it without fuss, breathing slow, steady breaths that Mika matched unconsciously. The staff often found themselves whispering when they watched, afraid that any loud sound might disturb the fragile peace the two had built. Word of their progress spread through the center. Volunteers drifted down the hallway just to catch a glimpse of the pair through the observation window, their faces softening into expressions of disbelief and tenderness. It was rare to witness something that felt like living proof that grief could bend without breaking. Even rarer to see healing take the shape of a dog's paw resting against an elephant's trunk. By the end of the third week, Mika's steps had grown steadier. He still walked cautiously, but now he would lift his head when he entered the room, searching for the familiar warmth at his side. Shadow, ever patient, ever constant, would rise and greet him with a gentle bump of his nose against the calf's shoulder, as if saying, "I'm here, I'm right here." And each time, with growing confidence, Mika would lean just slightly toward the sound, the scent, the presence he trusted more than anything else in his shadowed world. The spring morning broke warm and golden across the compound, the kind of gentle light that made the metal roofs glow and the pines shimmer as if dusted with silver. It was a rare, quiet day at Sierra. No storms rolling in, no urgent calls from the rangers, no frantic surgeries waiting in the clinic. The calm felt earned, almost sacred. And for the first time in months, Mika stepped into the larger training paddock with a steadiness that made Emily choke up behind her clipboard. Shadow entered first, trotting ahead with the loose, confident gait of a dog who finally had purpose again. His paws thumped lightly on the rubber flooring, circling the space with a quick assessment. Then he stopped beside the ramp, swung his head toward the door, and let out a short, crisp woof, his way of telling Mika the world was safe enough to enter. The little elephant followed, guided by two handlers but walking mostly under his own power now. His trunk lifted tentatively, brushing the air until it landed against Shadow's back with a soft thud. That single touch was all the reassurance he needed. His ears fluttered, his breathing settled, and he stepped fully into the room, trusting Shadow's presence the way he once trusted his mother's shadow on the ground. They began with familiar games, Shadow nudging the soft ball across the mat, Mika following by sound alone. The elephant's steps were still stiff, still careful, but no longer fueled by fear. Each time he reached the ball, he paused, brushing it with the tip of his trunk as if memorizing its texture. Shadow circled around him, tail wagging in slow arcs, a patient teacher guiding a student who learned through feel, not sight. Halfway through the session, something unexpected happened. A heavy metal cart outside the door tipped over as a volunteer lost her grip. The crash echoed like a gunshot through the hallway. The sound hit Mika first. His whole body jolted, legs splaying as panic surged through muscle memory. His trunk curled tight against his chest. For a heartbeat, the room held its breath, bracing for collapse. But Shadow moved before any human could. He darted to Mika's side, body pressed against the calf's foreleg with a steady, grounding weight. He let out a low, deliberate rumble, not unlike the vibration of a distant train rolling through a valley. Mika froze, the terror flickering in his chest like a candle caught between wind and wick. His trunk twitched, then slowly uncurled toward Shadow's shoulder. The panic didn't vanish, but it ebbed, broken by the dog's calm. From behind the glass, Samuel exhaled in awe. "He's interrupting the trauma loop," he murmured. "That's not instinct. That's learned empathy. Cross-species, no less." Linda, arms folded tight, just stared. She had seen animals do extraordinary things in her decades at Sierra, but nothing like this. Nothing so deliberate, so gentle, so impossible to categorize. After the scare passed, the room softened again. Mika leaned into Shadow's warmth, resting the tip of his trunk on the dog's back. Shadow didn't move away. He settled in deeper, anchoring the elephant with quiet devotion. Even the overhead lights seemed warmer, as if they understood the gravity of two lives choosing each other over fear. Later, as the session slowed, Emily placed a shallow basin near the mat, a small pool meant to encourage sensory exploration. Mika hesitated, uncertain, until Shadow dipped his paw into the water and splashed once. The sound drew Mika forward. He reached out, touched the water, then touched Shadow's paw, as if checking whether they were experiencing the same thing. His ears flared with something close to joy. It was the first time anyone at Sierra had seen him play. Not follow, not survive, play. The room filled with a soft ripple of laughter, quiet, careful, reverent. It wasn't loud enough to startle Mika, but just loud enough to honor the moment. As the session wound down and the sun dipped low across the windows, Shadow lay down on the mat, exhausted in the gentle way tiredness feels when it comes from purpose, not grief. Mika lowered himself beside him, trunk resting across the dog's side like a trust offering. The monitors hummed in steady rhythm. 2 heartbeats, no longer frayed, no longer out of sync. For the first time since arriving at Sierra, Mika fell asleep in an unfamiliar room without trembling. And for the first time since losing his owner, Shadow slept beside someone he was willing to protect. The staff stayed a moment longer than necessary, watching through the glass, unwilling to break the spell. Outside, the compound settled into dusk, the pines whispering in the wind and the fading sunlight painting the buildings gold. Inside the paddock, a blind baby elephant and a grieving dog breathed in a shared rhythm. 2 survivors who had somehow become each other's compass, each other's shelter from the storms they could no longer face alone. The summer dusk settled softly over Sierra, laying a warm glow across the hills and painting long shadows along the paddock walls. The air felt different now, lighter, almost celebratory, though no one had said anything out loud. It was simply the feeling that came when months of quiet hope finally found steady footing. In the center of the training yard, Mika stood taller than he ever had, his once fragile frame filling out with new strength. Shadow trotted beside him, tail sweeping in slow, content arcs. The research team from Colorado State had arrived earlier that afternoon, wheeling in cameras and soft-footed equipment. They spoke in low tones, careful not to disturb the pair they had traveled hundreds of miles to meet. Dr. Layton, a calm-voiced behavioral scientist with years of fieldwork behind her, watched Mika and Shadow with a mixture of awe and careful study. "I've seen elephants form bonds with other species," she murmured, "but never like this. Never this precise, this intentional." Emily stepped beside her, a quiet pride settling in her chest. They healed each other, she said simply, long before we understood what we were looking at. She didn't mention the nights Mika shook so hard she feared he wouldn't make it, or the mornings Shadow refused his food until he'd heard the calf's breathing from across the compound. Some truths didn't need embellishing. They lingered in the air like a soft hum, understood without explanation. Inside the paddock, Mika's trunk explored the new tactile path built along the perimeter, a raised line of smooth stones meant to help him map the space. Shadow walked just ahead, occasionally glancing back to ensure Mika's steps remained sure. When the calf stumbled slightly on a patch of uneven ground, Shadow pressed his side to Mika's leg, steadying him with a practiced ease that seemed almost instinctive. Cameras clicked quietly from beyond the fence. The turning point of the evening came when a sudden gust of wind caught the edge of the metal irrigation shed nearby. The panel door slammed shut with a sharp metallic crack, one of those quick, jarring sounds that had once sent Mika into total collapse. The room around the paddock fell still. Staff held their breath. But Mika didn't fold inward. His head jerked, his muscles tensed, but instead of crumpling, he turned toward Shadow. The dog was already in motion. He trotted close, nudged Mika's foreleg with his shoulder, and let out a deep, grounding rumble. Mika inhaled once, long and steady, his trunk brushing the top of Shadow's back. The wave of panic receded before it crested. A small, almost imperceptible sigh moved through the group of observers, relief mixed with astonishment. Later, as the sun dipped fully behind the ridge and cast long violet streaks across the sky, Linda stepped through the side gate to deliver the news they had been waiting to share. "The board has approved it," she said, her voice warm despite its measured tone. "We're partnering with the Cross-Species Behavior Institute in Arizona. They're building a dedicated habitat for both of them, a place where they can stay together permanently." Emily covered her mouth with her hand, emotion welling up unexpectedly. Samuel blinked hard behind his glasses. Even Aaron, who had spent a lifetime trying not to let hope outrun reason, allowed a smile to break slowly across his face. "They earned that," he said quietly. "In ways we'll be studying for years." When the staff gathered Mika and Shadow for the short walk back to their sleeping quarters, the evening air held a gentle calm. Mika walked with a confidence he hadn't possessed weeks earlier, guided not by ropes or handlers, but by Shadow's easy footfalls. At the threshold of the barn, Mika paused, an old habit. But Shadow nudged forward through his legs, bumping him gently until the calf stepped inside. The last light of day spilled softly across the straw-lined stall as Mika lowered himself to the ground. Shadow curled beside him without hesitation, resting his head across Mika's front leg. The calf's trunk draped instinctively across the dog's back, their breathing settling into the slow, shared rhythm that had become their quiet signature. Outside the barn, the compound lights flickered on one by one, humming faintly in the rising night. The world beyond Sierra was vast, unpredictable, and often unkind. But in this small corner of New Mexico, beneath a sky filling with stars, a blind calf and a grieving dog had rewritten the shape of survival. Not with medical miracles, not with theory, but with the simple, undeniable truth that love, unexpected, improbable, unasked for, had found them both and refused to let go. And as the night deepened, the two lay together in the warm hush of the barn, no longer broken pieces from separate tragedies, but a single story. One heartbeat steadying another in the dark, guiding it gently toward the light. If this story stayed with you, even for just a moment, I'd love to hear from you. You don't need to write anything long. Just leave a simple 0, 1, or even a single word in the comments, so I know you're still here, still traveling with these stories. And if you'd like to walk with me through the next chapter, through more true moments of courage, gentle kindness, and the unexpected bonds that shape our lives, I'd be grateful if you hit subscribe before you go. Your presence here matters more than you know. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you in the next story.